Hey everybody, welcome to Jimmy Wolf's Guitar Solo Countdown. No countdown, no guitar solos, but we're going to talk about the year 1969, and we're going to give our favorite record and what we think is the best record. Okay, so one's more of a personal, subjective choice, and the other one is, maybe more classic, objective. This is what is the best record. Sometimes they're different records, sometimes they're the same. Okay, and the co-captain's chair, I've got my good buddy Matt Boudreau, and there's gonna be a lot of fun. So so maybe I'll just throw it over to you, Matt. So maybe just give us a little introduction about what the year 1969 means to you, what it means to you in the context of rock and roll, and maybe just list off some of the records of that year, just to give a bit of an introduction of the content that was out that year.
Yeah, I'm gonna refer to some notes here because I don't want to forget anything. I mean, first off, like when I was kind of looking into this, a big thing I noticed is how much this year is referred to as possibly the greatest year in the history of rock music. There's a lot of mention of like, is 69 the best year? And when you go through what was released that year and sort of the quality, it's pretty hard to argue that point. You had a lot of the sort of best bands, I mean, arguably of all time, doing sort of their best work during that exact era. You know, like the Beatles were kind of coming to an end. The Stones were arguably sort of in their second coming already. You had, bands like, well, the progressive movement was just kind of getting off the ground. You had Hendrix. And then you had sort of this new movement of the seemingly coming out of almost like the Laurel Canyon thing. You had this sort of weird folk resurgence in the late 60s, and 69 sort of was a banner year for that kind of stuff as well. So looking back on it, I mean, it's funny how a lot of it almost seems like 69's a before and after point. Like there's the before 1969 stuff, and that kind of had a vibe, and then it's almost like, and I mean, maybe it was Woodstock, such a huge cultural event. I think, Isle of Wight's around the same time. And you have this, I mean, it's just everything plumed after that. And I'm sure you could certainly make the argument that the reason for that pluming is 69 was just such a banner year. There were so many great records that came out that, like, how do you top that, right? And like everyone was sort of, it almost felt competitive, like 69, it was almost like everyone's taking their shot at the Beatles are sort of on their way out. Who's going to be the new thing? What's music going to sound like in the 70s? And it's almost felt like everyone was sort of vying for position there. And what I noticed going through these records is like, there's a huge diversity there. And all of a sudden there's bands doing things that really hadn't been tried yet. There's a lot of bands trying things, and when we eventually get to the best and our favorites, like for me, that a lot of that came down to sort of like records that kind of came out of left field, stuff that like we were expecting to hear the Beatles do something great. We were expecting to hear the Stones do something great, but there's a lot of bands we weren't expecting great things from who did some pretty great things during that time, right? Like even the Grateful Dead, Oxua Moxua was that year. And for me, that record has always been the sort of the beginning of the really good Dead. They released Oxua Moxua, and then right on it, the heels of that came Working Man's Dead, American Beauty. And all of a sudden the Grateful Dead are one of the, best folk bands in the world. So yeah, for me, it's really an interesting year because of that sort of, I felt like everyone kind of had that sense that like, this is the time you make your big push. If you're going to do something different, let's do it now. And then, just for the staple bands, I mean, you got, okay, I'm going to go through a couple of records. You got Abbey Road. I mean, that's a pretty good record. You got 2 Zeppelin records in 69, which is Foolish. Yep. Right. And I mean, talk about something that's going to change the tide of music. I mean, Zeppelin 1 didn't come out that much earlier. I mean, that's 68. And then 69, you get hit with 2 Zeppelin records, 2 and 3 come out that year. And they're both incredible records.
So 69 was 1 and 2.
Oh, 1 and 2. Sorry, that's right. So 1 and 2. So I mean, the
3 was
first
70.
Zeppelin.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, you have the introduction of Zeppelin then. So that's again just goes to that sort of like out of left field. Here comes this band doing this thing that's like, what is this?
Yep.
What is this glorious thing that's happening? And then, before the end of the year, you get this other glorious thing, which, I mean, you could argue is better. I think I probably like Led Zeppelin 1 a little more, but both brilliant records. The Who, Tommy,
Yep.
which, for a lot of people, that's the Who record. We've got one of my, actually, In a Silent Way by Miles Davis, which is just happens to be one of my favorite records. So you had the fusion thing was hitting its stride hard at that point, right? Like that's when everyone sort of went face first into fusion music. Clouds, Joni Mitchell, amazing album. Some weird stuff. Trout Mask Replica was that year. Captain Beefheart.
I can add in really quickly now. So those records were off of Frank Zappa's label. He had 2 labels one was called Bizarre.
Yeah.
One was called Straight.
Yeah.
So he was pretty busy in 69. He had Captain Beefheart, the GTOs, I think. It's Girls Together Outrageously.
Right.
And he had a really bizarre record that was really interesting, actually. It was called, I wrote it down. It was called An Evening with Wildman Fisher, who apparently he was this homeless guy who was a little bit like out of his mind. And he would kind of just sing on the corner of I don't know, like one of those famous Los Angeles streets.
Okay.
And I think Zappa found him. It could have been a bit of exploitive thing.
Yeah.
Zappa was trying to find, freaky people.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that, I mean, there's quite a few. Oh yeah, and also he also produced the first Alice Cooper album too.
In 69.
Yeah.
Oh wow. And see, like there's another guy, like I actually really like the early Alice Cooper. It's got this weird like funk element to it that people, when you think of Alice Cooper, I don't think people realize those first 3 or 4 Alice Cooper records are not what you would think when you think Alice Cooper. It's like 70s glam rock mixed with some funk.
Yeah, kind of psychedelic,
Yeah. I mean, Welcome to My Nightmare. A lot of people know that one. And that's a pretty good representation of what he was doing at that time. But it's also like probably one of the heavier tunes as far as like the themes and stuff. So I mean, and that's another thing that's really cool about when you look back to 69 is that there's so many bands that are sort of like just under the surface during that era that were going to go on to be big bands. Like Alice Cooper's just getting out the door, and he didn't come out with a huge bang, but within a few years he was going to be a staple, right? And even like the Floyd, I believe it's Ummagumma in 69. So I mean, they were still figuring it out, but still there under the surface. You got the Stooges record that year,
yes,
which is another sort of benchmark of like, okay, now this thing is happening. I mean, we're now like already in 69, we're sort of being like, hey, punk is coming.
Yep. And the
MC5, right? Like again, it's just sort of this thing like, here's punk 5 or 6 years before punk's happening. And like here's prog before 2 or 3 years before we're going to figure prog out. So it's just such an incredibly interesting year. I mean, CCR released 2 or 3 records that year.
Yep.
That were all huge. Like I don't know how many hit singles are on those 2 or 3 records that all came out that year. And I mean, that's another thing is that this is an era where bands put out a record a year, right? If you weren't doing a record a year,
you're falling behind.
Yeah, I mean, there were so many. I mean, the Beatles did it, the Zepp did it, Cat Stevens, Grateful Dead, all bands that released 2 big records in a year, right? And like by today's standards, that's mental. Yep. It takes a band at least 3 years nowadays to get a record out, and a lot of the time it's more like a 4 or 5 year wait compared to the Beatles putting out 10 records in 8 years, or the Doors have 8 records in 4 or something foolish like that, where it's just the drive was to just get more music out, which I think is another thing that we've kind of lost. And it kind of got rid of some of that competitiveness that I think was legitimately like it seemed somewhat good natured. You know, when you hear these bands talking about each other back in the day, it's usually a positive thing.
Yep.
But there's also this sort of like the Beatles want to outdo the Beach Boys, and they want to make sure that they stay on top of the Stones, and the Stones want to like differentiate themselves from the Beatles. Like, hey, we're not like them. We're the bad boys of rock and roll. We're doing our thing. And then Zeppelin coming in and being like, you think you're bad boys of rock and roll? Check this out. You know, so there was this attitude and like, we got to get another one out. To quote the great line from, Pink Floyd, you got to get another album out.
Yep.
You owe it to the people. And it was like expected of bands back then that, you just keep hammering it out. So then you got John Fogerty writing 20 hit singles in a 12 months period,
Yeah.
What else do I have? Oh yeah. So I mentioned Oxo Moxo, which is sort of an underappreciated album for me. You never really hear it mentioned. It's actually a really great record. And for people who like sort of the American Beauty, Working Man's Dead, Grateful Dead, it's the precursor to that. So that was sort of an honorable mention for me because I really do love that record. So yeah, I mean, Blind Faith, that record came out that year. We got Olé by Beck. So I mean, even like for the underground stuff, there's just so much.
You mean Jeff Beck?
Jeff Beck, yeah. So I said Beck Olé, right? Which is a Beck record.
That's a Beck record. Yeah. I was like,
Ola
Beck
by
Ola.
Jeff Beck.
That's it. Yep.
Yeah, they're too close.
With the giant apple on the cover.
Yes.
That's a great record.
Amazing record.
Killer.
So yeah, like it's a very rich year. Like every sort of existing genre, it feels like it felt like everyone was at the table by 1969. Like all the big players had sort of made their entrance by then. So every band of the era that you can think of pretty much has a record in 69. I can't remember off the top of my head which Doors records. I mean, I assume there's more.
Soft Machine.
Soft
Parade?
Soft Parade. Yeah, Soft Machine is a progressive band.
Soft Machine did have a record though. I think it was it number 2? Soft Machine 2.
That would make sense. So yeah, I mean,
there's
Soft Parade's not my favorite Doors record, but it's good. I don't think the Doors put out a bad record. So yeah,
I think the critical consensus with the Doors is the first album's the best.
It's my favorite. And I think like for me, it kind of jumps first to last. I think the first one and the last one are the two best records. Actually, LA Woman might be my favorite. That's a tough one.
So that could be like best versus favorite.
That would be best versus favorite, I think, because there's a vibe to both of those records. One of them is like, here we are, we're this cool band, and the other one's like, here we are, we're this cool band, and they just like they aged 40 years in 4 years. There's a lot of wisdom on LA Woman. Jim Morrison did a lot of living, but yeah, that first Doors record was brilliant. But yeah, I mean, is it just the one they got out in 69? Just Soft Parade?
Just Soft Parade, yeah. Yeah, so I completely agree with everything that you said. For me, I think what I think about 1969 is it is a transition of it's kind of the end of the psychedelic 60s.
Yeah.
And yeah, you could kind of feel that with the two concerts that I usually think of. It's Woodstock is sort of the summation of what happened from the last 3 years. Then you have Altamont that was just,
oh yeah,
this is the end.
This is the end. Yeah, that's true.
And yeah, I agree too. It's like you have the end of the Beatles, but then you have the start of Zeppelin. So it is this sort of, out with the old, in with the new feeling. Same with, like this was the start of progressive rock. You had the first, Van de Graaff Generator album, first King Crimson album, first Yes record.
Mm-hmm.
So this is kind of the start of prog rock.
Yeah.
And yeah, so it's kind of the end of the psychedelic, but then the beginning of more serious music. Like,
that's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
Music did kind of get serious in 69.
Starting to get more serious. Yeah. Cause I mean,
60s kind of left the music.
Yeah, you could say like the psychedelic thing could have been a little goofy, maybe like
Yeah,
Strawberry Alarm Clock. I mean, there's obviously cool stuff like Floyd and
yeah,
cool psychedelic things, but yeah, it was a little goofy as well. Maybe it kind of got a little too colorful, a,
yeah,
a little too dreamy, a little too fantasy.
yeah. It became almost a little too fun for
Yeah,
the artists, right? Where everything kind of felt a little, like,
yeah, yeah,
and as the listener, you want a band to take their music seriously to some degree, right?
yep,
And yeah, I mean that the psychedelic thing. I mean, there was a lot of sort of poignant psychedelic music, but then it was definitely getting to that point of like it was getting a little silly.
yeah.
You know?
Like like most trends, right? You have like the credible side of a trend, and then you kind of have the back end of the trend. It's sort of
Where you
like
blow it out.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
and
absolutely.
maybe it's bands that are just kind of jumping onto the trend that don't really have much to say, kind of clouds it.
In the case, I think, is that people see the niche for in the market and just you know do it to death.
Yes,
And that but I mean that at the same time kind of helps usher out that movement because once you see that happen, it's like, oh, it's time to move on to the next thing. The vultures have arrived.
yep, yep.
Puddle of Mud helped us get rid of grunge.
That's true. Okay, Matt. So I'll just add a couple more. So this was a busy year for Deep Purple.
Oh yeah,
They
yeah.
had their third record, which was self-titled.
Mhm,
That Crazy Bosch album cover.
mhm.
And then they also had a really amazing live album called Concerto for Group and Orchestra, which is one of my favorite Deep Purple albums. It has Malcolm Arnold as the conductor.
Oh wow. Okay, I don't even know this one.
Pretty serious record, yeah. Chorus Crosby, Stills and Nash.
Oh yeah, I meant to mention that one.
Yeah. One of my favorites, Sly and the Family Stone albums, Stand.
Oh yeah, yeah. My favorite Sly record.
Probably one of the greatest soul records of all time, Isaac Hayes, Hot Buttered Soul. Killer,
Yeah.
killer album. Yeah, you mentioned all the Who. I think. Oh yeah, the Beach Boys had 2020.
Oh yeah.
I love it. Probably not that significant a record.
Good though.
Good, yeah, and also very notorious for having one of the Charles Manson songs on it.
That's right. That's right. One of his few compositions.
Yep. Frank Zappa had some pretty important albums this year: Hot Rats
Hmm.
and Uncle Meat.
Hmm.
It was the soundtrack to a movie. But I think Zappa was, yeah, he was just also very busy as a record producer and also as a label guy too, right? I mentioned that.
Yeah, that was a weird phase for him.
Yes. Yeah, I think this was kind of the end of his label excursion. I think after the 60s, he became more an artist
Yeah,
in his own right.
yeah,
I think he still did a little bit of producing in the 70s, but nothing really super
I
notable.
believe so. But certainly, like the Mothers of Invention kind of became the focus of his career, right? From that point.
Yep. Yep. Um okay, so Matt, how about we just jump into it? So what is your favorite record of 1969?
All right, so this is hard because when we originally talked about doing this, instantly two records popped into my head, and right off the bat, I couldn't tell which one was my favorite, and which one was the best, and I kept going back and forth, and then I started thinking maybe one of these is just my favorite and the best, but I couldn't do that. I couldn't do it.
Yeah.
Um, so I mean, as I'm sitting here right now, I know what I told myself I was going to say. And even right now, I'm kind of fighting like, which one's the best and which one's my favorite?
Say
But
say you know what? Say them both. Let's
the
do it.
two records, the two records, and I brought visuals. Check this out. Okay. So first here, we've got
The Brown album.
the Brown album, the second band record, 1969. Maybe slightly less culturally significant than the first, but maybe not. I personally think it's the better record. I love Music for the Big Pink, but this record just sort of has the man. They nailed the vibe of this sort of Americana folk rock country thing that they created that still exists, by the way. Like you've got
Yep.
bands like Wilco and stuff doing it 40 years later. Um, But yeah, for me, that one, it'd be hard to make an argument that there was a better record than that. So my sort of go-to was that was the best record of that year. I mean, I
Right.
can't think. I went through this year quite a bit. I can't find another record that gets as much sort of influential praise as that record. You know, like everybody loved the first two band records. The Beatles were obsessed. Pink Floyd were obsessed. The Grateful Dead were obsessed. All their peers were kind of just, oh, well, this is how you do it. And so for me, that's like a really landmark, like, because they really didn't have, there's no pretension on the record. There's just none. It's just these very songy songs. You know what I mean? So that's that. And then the other one, no surprise here.
Ah, amazing.
In the Court of the Crimson King, King Crimson, there had just never been anything remotely like this. You know, like I don't know if there's a better out of left field album in the history of time than In the Court of the Crimson King. I was reading some quotes from like Melody Maker and, you know, the old sort of British rock magazines. And you had people like Pete Townsend being like, well, this is a masterpiece. This is the best band in the world right here. And for bands that were like, you know, well, for Pete Townsend to say something nice about anything, it must be pretty good.
Oh yeah.
And I think, you know, there's the famous story of they opened for the Stones, and apparently after Crimson played, you know, Mick and Keith were just sort of looking at their management like, what did you do to us? We got to play after that? Why? You know, and I mean, coming out there with Under My Thumb after Schizoid Man, I mean, great. I love the Stones. But for intensity, nothing came close to that. This was music that like took your head off. And so for me, that it's so unique, it's so different. Even the prog of the time, because I mean, they kind of came out with, like you said, Yes kind of debuted. The Moody Blues had been around for a couple of years. They were almost doing a proggy thing, but certainly not to the degree that Crimson took it, where they took rock music, jazz music, straight classical music, and just fused the hell out of it into this weird thing that, frankly, the first time I heard it, I didn't know what the heck I was listening to, because the year it came out and everything, it's just like processing it, like music like this did not exist in 1969. What are you talking about? So it's just such a, man, yeah, it still blows my mind. So I think that would have to be, and it's by millimeters, where I would say that Crimson's probably my favorite record of that year.
Nice.
And I think that I'd probably say the Brown record is the best record of that year. That would be so, with an honorable mention. I got one more album here, just because I can't not mention this.
That's good.
Right? We barely mentioned it. Abbey Road. It's like probably my second or third favorite Beatles record. I really love it.
Amazing.
But you know, it's just the Beatles continuing to be great, right? They're not totally doing something new. They're just doing more great stuff. And it's an amazing record. But compared to sort of Crimson doing something no one had ever heard before, the band kind of reinventing what, you know, rock music was at the time, and having a lot of people, I feel like they kind of jumped on either the Zeppelin bandwagon or the band bandwagon. It was sort of, those were the two directions I saw music take after 69, was sort of like, okay, we're going to lean into being the hard rock band, Deep Purple, Black Sabbath, or we're going to lean into being this band that writes simple, beautiful music, Pink Floyd, the Grateful Dead. And it sort of split rock off a little bit in two really great directions, and it kind of like these, you know, and Crimson, that record helped to sort of start off this whole, I mean, prog rock might not be, well, I would argue that it certainly wouldn't be what it is if that record didn't come out. I feel like that record sort of legitimized, because I mean, what Yes were doing and what the Moody Blues were doing, it didn't have the gravitas. Somehow King Crimson managed to get their hands on this like authority that they played with, where everyone immediately said like, that's the band. And God love them if they had kept that band together for, I don't know, one more record.
I think the consensus with Yes and Crimson was that Crimson came out of the gate as strong as you can be,
Yeah,
whereas Yes took several records to get
to
to
hit
that
their
point.
stride.
Yeah. So the
Yeah.
first Yes record isn't usually considered their best record. It's usually
Oh, I mean, it's not even a record I listen to a ton. I like it. It's cool. It's cool that it came out in '69 and it's still weird for that year,
yeah.
but it doesn't have the, like I said, for me, when I think about that record, Court of the Crimson King, it's always this thought of authority. It's like these guys came out and it felt like
Very
they'd been
confident.
very confident. It's like they've been writing and playing this record for 10 years behind closed doors and then came out and like dropped it in front of you and said like, listen to this. You know what I mean? It was just so like, you can't handle this and we know it. And I mean, I was probably 18. You know, I wasn't a kid the first time I heard the Court of the Crimson King. It came to me very, very late because this was, I mean, age myself a little bit here. This was before like the internet was what it is now, where you can just find anything. And even when I did manage to get my hands on a copy of that record, like it took me years to get my hands on more King Crimson. You know, the CDs weren't in the stores. Their music wasn't on the Napsters and the Kazas and the LimeWires of the day. So it was really hard to find, which added to this mystique of like, I need to know more about this band. And I can still remember like finding a copy of this record and you know on CD, which was like, oh, okay, here we go. Getting it out into the car with my buddies, putting it on, and we didn't speak for 45 minutes. Right? We just sat there with our jaws dropped a little bit, like they were doing this in '69. Come on, this is incredible. And like the musicianship on it, the playing on it. I mean, I still haven't figured out Robert Fripp, and I've been listening to them now for 20 odd years, and I'm still trying to figure out what the hell that guy's motive is. He's such an odd guitar player.
He's got the weirdest guitar solos, absolutely. Like
Oh,
like sometimes it's an angular diminished thing that he does, and then other times it's this beautiful ethereal thing, and then there's yeah, and then some of the solos that you play me like off of was it like Easy Money or one of those songs where it just sounds like
yeah.
he's trying to play badly.
Intentionally. I feel like Fripp's humor comes out in his solos.
Yeah.
And to him, it's really funny. And to everyone else, it can be very like, what are you doing? What is this supposed to be? I think we've actually talked in the past about like his solo for A Sailor's Tale, which
Yeah.
is this weird, like it's all chords,
Chord solo.
like
Yeah.
with a strange slapback delay on the guitar, and it goes on for quite some time of him just sort of playing like what seems at first like a funky rhythm, and the longer he plays it, it's like the less funky he's trying to make it, and he's trying to not hit the beat, and he's trying to find those little micro beats in between the beats to intentionally make you uncomfortable. Um, and I think that's sort of like Fripp's sense of humor is always do not get comfortable with my music because I'll ruin it for you.
Yeah.
You know, there's keep your expectations turned off. The moment you switch on your expectations with King Crimson, you're in for a bumpy ride because he's not going to allow that to happen for you, right? It's going to change. And I feel like anytime he gets a chance to solo, it's like, well, if we haven't changed it yet, I'm going to make sure we change it now. And you just did on your channel, you just did the Schizoid Man solo not too long ago. And that, I mean, that's always fascinated me, that solo. Because I remember being young and thinking, like, I could play this whole solo with one finger. And at one point, I sat down and learned how to do it with basically with one finger, the whole thing, and thinking, like, why? Why would you write this? But then when you look at it in context, it's like, well, the song is called 21st Century Schizoid Man. It's got a very schizophrenic feel to it. So it wouldn't make sense if the solo kicked in and all of a sudden you were lulled into a sense of pentatonic bliss. You know, it makes more sense that you're kind of like, do these notes go? Does this make sense? Can this guy play guitar? And that's a big thing I notice when I show people King Crimson is like other guitar players, you know, because I've got a lot of guitar playing buddies, will say like, is this guy any good? Is he terrible? Like, no, he's amazing. But the fact that you think he might be terrible is what he's going for. He doesn't want you to be able to like put a finger on him at all. Because I mean, you've heard a lot of the stuff he's done, like with like the stuff he did with Giles and Fripp or something. I've showed you a little bit of that where it's like clearly this guy is an incredibly gifted technical guitar player. He can play a million miles a minute and he can pick like a madman and all this stuff, but he doesn't.
Yeah,
He like goes out of his way to not play nice things and not impress you with his incredible technical ability, and you almost notice it by accident. You know, when you're listening to Lark's Tongues and Aspic or something, and then you go, "Wait, this sounds hard. How's he playing this?" And then you see a video and go, "Wow, okay, this guy's a beast."
yeah,
But goes out of his way to, and I think that's one of the reasons I really love in the Court of the Crimson King is he had some other guys there that were, I mean, immensely talented guys. I mean, Greg Lake singing on this record, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, Ian McDonald, who I believe went on to form Foreigner, um, and then Michael Giles, who just sort of one of the best rat-a-tat boom bang drummers I've ever heard, even though I've only heard him on 2 records. He had that sort of Keith Moon, if you gave Keith Moon some speed.
yeah.
You know, like it was even wilder than Keith Moon, and just
Like
sort of,
it is like truly a fusion of jazz and rock, right? And a
yeah,
lot of drummers were doing that sort of jazz
yeah,
rock thing in the 60s.
yeah.
Yeah,
Mitch Mitchell, another guy who's sort of that sort of like
totally.
just just fill all the time, just keep filling,
Yeah.
never stop,
And
and
it has a bit of a swing to it like the whole time too, right?
always swinging and very frenetic, very like keeps your shoulders kind of moving when you're listening to it. You can't, they almost don't want you to find the pocket.
Yeah.
And the moment that you feel like you have it, they turn the beat around so that you feel like you fell out of it. And yeah, I think that sort of the melodic sensibilities of particularly Greg Lake and Ian McDonald on this record help to sort of temper Fripp's proclivity to not play something nice, because he really does love to make you work for the melody. You know, he likes to hide it a little bit, whereas Ian McDonald and Greg Lake are both sort of, I would say, a little bit more classically, melodically influenced. So, you know, what they sing and what they do makes a little bit more conventional sense than what Fripp would do. So for me, that makes this record in particular so much different than everything Crimson did later, because after this record, it was the Robert Fripp show, right? It was never King Crimson again. I mean, it was, but it was Dave Mustaine and Megadeth.
I was just gonna say that. Yeah.
Right? It was like, here's my ever evolving band of brilliant musicians, and man, he had so many brilliant musicians in and out of that band. I mean, Boz from Bad Company, John Wetton goes on to form Asia. Like the amount of bands that came out of King Crimson is really, it's alarming. You know, and then he takes Bill Bruford from Yes, and but yeah, this one record really was that sort of, it was a band. They wrote this record together, and I think that, like, for me, even, and like I said, I was reading sort of these old articles, and even the musicians of the time all seem to have this like, listen, that's something else. That record is, we don't get it yet, but that's the best thing out right now. Like everyone had this band is just too good. And I think that's part of the reason it fell apart, is like I mean, within 6 months of that record coming out, they basically weren't a band anymore. But during that 6 months, they kind of leapt to being the greatest band in the world almost immediately, in like 3 or 4 shows. Like when they did that show, I can't remember where it was now, but they played, and like I was saying, they opened for the Stones, and it was this sort of famous thing where they just blew the doors off of everybody. And the Stones legitimately did not want to go on stage afterwards, because they were like, that's not the type of band we are. We're not going to bring that energy, you know.
Now Matt was in the in the Wake of Poseidon. That was the second record.
Yeah.
Wasn't that the same band as this album?
So what happened was, basically during the tour for the first record, the record label immediately started saying, yo, you know, you got to get another album out. Everybody quit except Robert. And Robert was like, hey, you know, we've made it, please don't quit the band, kind of thing. And so what happened on the Wake of Poseidon is nobody was in the band, but they stayed to do the record for basically because Robert asked them to. So Greg Lake doesn't play bass on the second record, but he sings it.
Okay.
So he literally came in, just did all the vocal tracks, and then said, okay, best of luck to you in the future. I'm going to go join ELP. Michael Giles did it purely as a favor. Same thing. Ian McDonald, he's only on a couple of songs on that record. Again, as a favor. That's actually when I believe they brought in first appearance of Mel Collins, who became kind of a staple of King Crimson later. So he did some of the sax work and stuff on Poseidon. And then Peter Giles, Michael's brother, did the bass for the second record. And he had been in Giles, and Fripp, which is the band that Michael and Robert were in the year before Court of the Crimson King came out. So sort of the precursor to King Crimson. So that second record was really bizarre because basically Robert begged the other guys, or I shouldn't say he begged, I don't know that, but he asked them to stay just to get the record done. And then he brought in people to kind of fill it out. So like the Mel Collins, Peter Giles, he brought in a couple of sort of session guys to do pianos and that kind of thing. So like Cat Food, probably my favorite song on that record.
Love Cat Food.
Yeah, wicked tune.
You know what? I will say I always wanted, if in a perfect world, if they took the best songs from
those two records and made one record,
mash them together. Yeah.
I literally said that like 2 days ago because I actually just found In the Wake of Poseidon on vinyl and I've been looking for it forever. And it's really weird because it almost feels like they just sort of took the first record, went through it and went like, okay, so we started off with the crazy progressive song that's got all the sort of syncopated and crazy prog stuff in it. Start there. Then we do the gentle song.
Yeah.
We do the sort of weird song. Then we do the epic song with the big mellotrons. It's got this really formulaic thing going on.
It feels like a sequel for sure.
It feels like a sequel, with the exception of Cat Food, which kind of holds its own place on the record.
Okay, Maddie. So I'm going to go straight into my picks here.
Cool.
Okay, so by the way, I totally agree with what you said. I thought of those albums. This actually took me a long time to figure this out because it's especially I find finding your favorite album. I find is a lot easier than finding out what the best album is because it's hard to be subjective and objective, right? Because I think with that one, you have to be a little bit more analytical.
Yeah.
And say, maybe put your own personal opinion aside, like what you think is the best. So finding the best album of this era was very hard.
Yeah.
I struggled with that. Okay, so I'm just gonna go with my favorite first. I have to go with Zeppelin. Yeah, I even wore a Zeppelin shirt. You can't really see it, but I'm in love with Zeppelin. I fell in love with them when I first heard them. It changed my life. It's in my musical DNA, I guess you could say. So I can't get rid of Zeppelin. They're just always there.
I predicted this one.
Yeah.
I said I think Jimmy will go with Zeppelin one as his favorite. Based on what I know of you, that's what I assumed.
And for me, it's just the opening, Good Times, Bad Times, the drumming. I mean, no one's gonna. He is the greatest drummer of all time. No one's gonna disagree with that.
Yeah, no, he's the rock drummer.
Yeah, maybe Cozy Powell second, but yeah, I mean, yeah, no one.
Pretty hard to argue against Bonham, right? Like it's almost like as a culture we've come to accept that no, it's Bonham.
It's Bonham. Bonham. And you could say maybe Neil Peart, but you know what? Like Bonham had that weight. He had that jazz.
Yeah,
he had everything, right?
For a rock drummer, you need groove for rock music. I love Neil Peart. I think he was a great drummer. Neil Peart doesn't groove. He's got quick hands. He's powerful, but not the same kind of powerful as John Bonham. Bonham sounds like there is lead weights in his hands and feet.
Yeah.
There's just this doom that happens when he hits a drum. And then his feel is I get when people compare Dave Grohl to Bonham because those two elements, for me, that's what Grohl has that makes him comparable. I don't think Grohl's, I don't really think he's in that ballpark as far as pure talent. I mean, Grohl's an amazing drummer, but what he does have is this sort of like he hits with a lot of weight, and it's this like unbreakable groove where like he can make something funky even though it's like a driving rock beat. It's got this weird groove to it, and I think the first Zeppelin record is the best example of Bonham's drumming. It's this weird raw, the way it's produced, the way it's mixed, it's like it's such a raw drum album. There's you can hear the almost like the mistakes are still there, and the ghost notes are all there, and just the whole presentation of this. And that's the great thing about that first record, is that it really sounds like a band playing a record. It's cool that you picked this one, because this was the first record I ever owned that was a guitar record, was Led Zeppelin 1. I was like 8 years old. I just got my first guitar lesson, and I didn't really know a whole lot of guitar music. I knew a little bit of the stuff I grew up on: Springsteen, Rod Stewart, The Faces, that kind of the stuff, I got from my mom. And my guitar teacher was like, well, why don't you check out some, I don't know, Led Zeppelin, and at the time, this was 1990, maybe 1991. So it was like, go check out some Led Zeppelin, get yourself some Def Leppard. So I remember the same day I got Led Zeppelin 1, I got On Through the Night by Def Leppard at the local Woolworths. And I did not like On Through the Night very much. I've come to sort of like it. Rock Brigade's a pretty good song. It's got its moments. But that first Zeppelin record, I put that in the old Sony Walkman.
Oh,
and
nice.
Sport. It did not. Yeah.
The yellow one. Yeah.
The yellow one.
Yeah.
And it didn't come out of that thing for months. And I can remember going to like my friends, the other 7 and 8 year olds, and being like, you got to hear this. And it scared them. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like, it was kind of scary music. And I remember just being so in love with, Dazed and Confused mesmerized me. Just, I couldn't figure out what like kind of music this was. And to this day, that's my favorite Zeppelin record, is the first one. I mean, kind of to your argument of what we were just saying, objectively, do I think it's the best Zeppelin record? Probably not. It's hard to argue against 4 in that regard. I mean, I've listened to 4 also so much that like it's ingrained in my being, but there's something about the first one. It's got this vibe that sounds like a rock and roll band.
Yeah, for me, it's the amalgamation or the fusion of all these different styles. Like, it's got, obviously, it's known for having stolen a bunch of blues, verses even. So it's very bluesy. It's rocky, so it's got its own. I mean, you could even say this is technically one of the first heavy metal records. I don't like to throw that word heavy metal around. I would just say, like, it's a heavy rock album.
It's a heavy, that's it's always bothered me when people hit Led Zeppelin with the heavy metal thing. It's like, there's never been a more rock and roll band than Led Zeppelin. So why would you ever call them heavy? Like, yes, they've got heavy stuff. Like, I think of Dazed and Confused as a heavy song, sort of in the way that I think of early Black Sabbath, like the song Black Sabbath, as a heavy song. It's heavy in tone and mood.
Yes. But I would call that first Sabbath song the first real heavy metal song.
I would agree with that. Yeah, because they added an element of doom to it.
It's like really, really personifying evil. Like, it's
it feels evil, whereas Dazed and Confused feels
well. Okay, you know what? I will say though, with a song like Dazed and Confused, and even How Many More Times, I think this is the only band that I can think of that made psychedelic music heavy, like heavy psychedelic rock. I can't think of anyone else who did it better than Zeppelin, because Dazed and Confused is a psychedelic song too.
100%.
He's playing the guitar with his violin bow.
Yeah.
And that whole section of the song is extremely psychedelic.
Yeah.
And it's bluesy, psychedelic, heavy. Like, no one else did it like that before or after. It's this really unique moment in rock history. I think it's just this perfect, like, amalgamation of what was happening in the 60s.
Yeah, they really had their, and I mean, you look at the way, you had Jimmy and John Paul both coming from sort of, these were like pro musicians, session guys that have played with a lot of different people and had a lot to draw on. And then you had rock drummer Incarnate, who could, basically play anything. And then, I mean, Robert Plant as a vocalist often imitated, never duplicated, right? I mean, lots of people try to sound like Robert Plant,
Yeah.
but to have the power that guy, especially on that first record, man, when
his voice
he had his voice,
yeah.
I mean, for all of the great imitators that came afterwards, I've never heard anyone put that kind of. There was a low end in Robert's high pitched voice, right? When he would go way up there and push those high notes, there was this gravelly push to it that you don't hear out of, like a guy like David Coverdale, who's a great singer. David Coverdale is maybe one of the best Robert Plant imitators. But he doesn't have that thing. Everything sounds like it's coming from the chest. Yeah. Whereas with Robert, it feels like it's coming from his gut. Like he's really hollering these notes and like pushing them. And that's such an odd thing for a man who sings up there. And I mean, you hear it all the time. I don't think it really lasted that long for Robert where he could do that with that authority because it's unnatural. A few years later, he wasn't hitting those notes the same way, but on that record, it sounds effortless. And I mean, they made that record in a couple of weeks, right?
Yeah.
Like they just went in, literally did the bed tracks, and then Robert sang it a few times and they were done. Yep. Right? Very little overdubbing, and it's just so raw, right? And I mean, it's a pretty amazing thing when like arguably the least talented musician in the band is Jimmy Page. That's a pretty amazing thing to have in your band, where it's like he's the weak link. Jimmy's amazing, but then you have John Paul Jones, like maybe the greatest rock bass player ever, who doesn't get credit for being like the best rock bass player ever. Yeah. And then you could also make an argument for them having the greatest rock and roll singer ever. I mean, for pure rock and roll, it would be pretty hard to argue against Robert Plant in his prime. Yeah. So yeah, that Zeppelin as a whole are just so unique. And that first album, I think, like, talk about a band that like represents themselves properly coming out of the gate. No one did it as good as Zeppelin. That first record tells you everything you need to know about that band.
Yeah.
And all they did later was sort of improve. And, I mean, they tried some stuff later, but for the first 5 or 6 records, they're basically just continuing the trend of that first record and just honing it.
You can definitely argue that the playing on the first album is probably their best playing.
It's just so raw.
Yeah. Like everyone is just at the peak of their performance abilities.
Yeah.
You could say that there's much more important Zeppelin album tracks on the later.
Like songs,
yeah. And just importance in culture. But yeah, as far as just a band going into the studio, for 2 weeks or whatever it was, and just playing their asses off, right?
Yeah.
It's completely insane.
Yeah.
Yeah. So for me, it's like, I really do see music as there's music before Zeppelin and there's music after.
100%. And that, going back to sort of what we started talking about, you had Zeppelin come out that year, you had King Crimson come out that year, and you had the band making their second record that year. Music couldn't be the same after that.
No.
It just couldn't, right? Like you couldn't be a rock band and not reference Led Zeppelin. You couldn't be a psychedelic folk rock band or a folk rock band and not reference the band. You couldn't be a prog band and not reference King Crimson. And it's the same thing, I think, with the Zeppelin record as with particularly the Crimson record, where it's like these guys got something to prove. Yep. And they came out with that, like we were talking about before, with this confidence of like, you're going to like this. No one's doing this. This is our thing. And no one was doing what Zeppelin was doing. And then within, a year or two, lots of people were doing with what Zeppelin was doing, right? They created a sort of better version of rock music where it's like, no, rock music now has cojones, yep. Right? It's this powerful thing. And I mean, you hear it talked about with Zeppelin so much where like they were a force, right? Like, and you go and you watch them play live. And I think when How the West Was Won came out, that was a really eye-opening moment for me. I was always a Zeppelin fan, but when I heard that and sort of the power that band played with live, it was like, Oh, okay, I get it. I really get it now. I can remember me and you listening to that one night actually, and just being like, "Wow, this is a live band right here. This is some powerful players doing powerful music."
Yeah, that album was killer because, and I remember I had heard of it, but you were the first one to really kind of play it for me.
Yeah,
Because I think the problem that Zeppelin did was they released the wrong live album because they
big
released
time.
the song Remains the Same,
Yeah,
which I mean it has magical moments in it,
for sure.
especially Dazed and Confused. I thought just that what are they doing?
Maybe my favorite version of that. It's so it scares me. I love it.
Yeah, but it's a little thin,
It's
right?
a little thin. It's up and down. I think it was a classic case of like they were caught up in the era and maybe trying to do a little too much with it instead of just like recording a show and releasing it.
Yeah,
Whereas How the West was one all predates that, where it was just, oh, can you get a recording of the soundboard tonight?
yeah.
And they're not thinking about it. They just went out and did their thing. And the result is, I
Oh, it's
mean,
killer. Yeah.
it's so powerful. I mean, that's a hard hitting band.
And to be honest, this is a very controversial thing to say, but I my opinion is Houses of the Holy is one of the band's weakest albums.
I'm
But
with you there. It's got a couple of my favorite songs.
yes, but that album does have its diehard fans too.
Yeah.
But I think that album came out for the Song Remains the Same concert, so a lot of that album is on the Song Remains the Same.
Yeah.
For some reason,
And
I feel like Zeppelin's just being too prog rock on that album, or they're being a little too experimental.
yeah, I feel like they just I love No Quarter is such a great song.
And Over the Hills and Far Away is
Over
classic.
the Hills and Far Away, like, one of my favorite Zeppelin songs without question. But then, you've got Jamaica.
Sure. Yeah.
Jamaica, which I'll never understand. And isn't the crunge on
Probably
that record
Zeppelin's worst song, probably.
Zeppelin's worst song? Certainly it is for me. Although I do get that line caught in my head all the time. Dun, 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 dun. I do get that caught in my head all the time, and it's a cool synth sound or something. However, it's a terrible song. And yeah, that record, it just felt a little phoned in.
I think okay, so my impression of that record, I don't want to get too off topic, but it's basically Zeppelin is at the top of the world in 1973, right?
They got nothing to
And
prove.
and I think they're probably saying to themselves, we can do whatever we want. We can do a funk track, we can
Mhm.
do a reggae track, we can sound like King Crimson with the Rain song, do
But
whatever we want.
right?
Yeah.
But yeah, that was, I mean, Physical Graffiti came right on the heels of that, right?
Which I think is probably one of the greatest albums of all time.
One of the best records ever made by anyone. So yeah, it feels like they kind of figured it out after they released that record. Like, oh, we might have taken a step in the wrong direction here. Let's go back to being the best rock and roll band in the world and do that instead. And then, Physical Graffiti.
Yeah,
That might,
it's like we kind of forgot what we were amazing at for the first few records. Let's bring
Yeah.
that back.
and I think, that happens to most of the great bands, right? Like at some point, somewhere there in the middle, they make a weird one and then go, wait, what did we make that one for?
Yeah.
So yeah. But I mean, and even if you looked at Physical Graffiti and then you put it next to Led Zeppelin 1, it's such an easy line to draw.
Yeah.
Right? Like, it's just a natural evolution of that band. Like the songwriting has gotten a little more sophisticated.
Yep.
The production's gotten a little bit more sophisticated. The playing isn't as raw, but it's still raw, and but maybe a little more polished, right? And I really love that about Zeppelin, that it's all of Zeppelin. I mean, with the exception of a few tracks probably on Houses of the Holy that just shouldn't be in the catalog at all. They were so consistent. And I mean, I guess you could say like the last two records, they let a little bit more of that prog thing in on the last two records. In Through the Outdoor, it was sort of like classy prog. And Presence, I found like they were kind of doing like this really mostly still just rock and roll, but with this little bit of like, yeah, we're aware of Yes and King Crimson. We know what they're doing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Throwing a little bit in there just to remind you guys, like, we can play.
Yeah, Presence is a weird album. It takes a bit of getting into, but once you get into it, it's like, oh
I
yeah.
love it now. It
Why?
honestly took me years. I would just listen to all the other records and kind of avoid Presence and in Through the Outdoor a little bit too, to some extent.
Yeah.
And then once I got into them, they actually became among my favorite records because there's this weird class to them that's like, ooh, you guys got really sophisticated all of a sudden.
Yeah.
Dig
Yeah.
that.
Well, and you can also see that like by 1976, Zeppelin was starting to kind of be beaten a bit. I mean, like Aerosmith's Rocks
Yeah.
album, and I mean Judas
Yeah.
Priest with Sad Wings.
You had people coming in and doing their thing.
Yeah,
just
doing it better
good
than
almost.
them.
Not
Yeah.
better. Yeah. I mean, yeah. And Aerosmith were all young and full of it, right? Whereas Zeppelin were like, even though they were relatively young men, they've been at it for 8 years and it was showing. These were hard living 70s rock and roll guys, not known for living long, productive lives. So yeah, I think they were just getting a little tired. And in a way, it was cool because they saw the Aerosmiths coming and stuff and said, okay, let the kids have their fun. Let's
Yeah.
make some real grown-up rock music. And then you get Presence and In Through the Outdoor, which it's like adult rock and roll, not adult contemporary music. It's like really sophisticated rock and roll music. And I think that was part of like me not getting it when I was 14, right? It was like, I love Immigrant Song, but the rest of this is just, what are they doing? And now listening to it and loving it, right? So
Yeah. Zeppelin 3 was the one album that really grew on me as I got older.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's an odd one, right? Isn't Zeppelin 3 is kind of, that's the acoustic one, right?
That's their folkier one. Yeah.
It's like half the songs on it are just acoustic guitars. And when you're a young Zeppelin fan,
Yeah.
you're
You
like,
don't like that.
where's my rock and roll? There's too much nice singing on this and acoustic melody. I don't want that. And now I definitely want that. I love Led Zeppelin 3. But yeah, I was kind of the same way with that one too. It was all Zepp 1, 2, and 4 were
Yep.
sort of just played to death when I was a teenager.
Yep.
And then the older I got, the more Physical Graffiti kind of took over as my favorite, really. And then Presence and In Through the Outdoor became much more a part of my daily listening than they were as a teenager.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, Maddie. So that was easy for me. My favorite was easy.
Yeah.
I struggled with what I think is the best. I mean, you covered, three classics like Abbey Road, the Brown album. I mean, the first King Crimson album, of course, right? Just epic. I even thought about Let It Bleed by the Stones. I mean,
Amazing record, man.
like only for the fact that it has classic songs that we still hear in movies and commercials. I mean, I just heard you can't always get what you
Yeah.
want in
There's
a
what,
movie
three
and in like two
matches.
commercials. Yeah, crazy. And obviously, Give Me Shelter. I mean, that's a
pretty big song.
I also thought about, you know what, honestly, I thought about Neil Young's second record.
Yeah, I actually gave that a spin because of this podcast. I actually listened to that record because I was like, I know that's a great record and I love it.
It's killer. Yep.
Could that be considered? And I mean, it's certainly one of the best of the year. There's no doubt about that.
Yep. Yeah. For me, I even thought Hot Buttered Soul. I mean, I just like Isaac Hayes' voice and just those long drawn out like soul songs. I mean, that changed music forever as well, right? So I struggled with that one too. You know what? But I I probably picked the most conservative choice for me. I had to go with Zeppelin 2. I think this is the
Good
best album
choice.
here. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think they I can't escape the classics on here. I mean, Whole Lot of Love. Heartbreaker. I mean, that riff.
Mm-hmm.
Living, Loving, Maid. Always loved it. Ramble On. That guitar solo. That kind of pedal steely sounding solo. I mean, Bring It On Home. I mean,
It's
it's definitely not my favorite Zeppelin album, but like this album
as a record.
That the first album wasn't just an accident.
Yeah, like 8 months later.
8 months later. Yeah. And this established Zeppelin as the greatest band in the world at this time.
Yeah.
Now this is where you could argue, is it the best album? And does the band do they have better songs? probably. Does the Rolling Stones have better lyrics? For sure, I'd say the songs are much better
Yeah.
lyrically. But I think me just being a musician, for
Yeah.
me, I always hear music first. I always hear riffs first. I always hear the overall vibe first.
Yeah.
Lyrics for me are always secondary in rock and roll.
I
So
just had that conversation literally yesterday about how I love a good lyric. You know, I really do. Um,
yeah,
but it's I I can love a song that has terrible lyrics. Like I can really love a song with bad lyrics.
yeah, me too.
I can't love a song that has a great lyric and not a great melody.
Yep.
You know, like I'm a huge The Band fan. I'm not a huge Bob Dylan guy, which always surprises people because it's like, well, yeah, and I'm no, the guy writes great words, and if you're a poet, you're a lyric writer, I get it. The guy really knew how to string some words together, but I need a little bit more than that out of my music. I'm like you said, I'm a musician.
Yeah,
I'm listening for the music.
yeah,
So yeah, I totally get that with Zeppelin too, because it's just you don't have to. You're not supposed to think about it. You're supposed to put it on, and then it immediately puts you in that place where you're just listening and you're just feeling these vibes and these riffs that are like have become, you know,
yeah,
anthematic to what music is, right? Like everyone knows the riff from Whole Lotta Love, and if you don't, like you're living under some weird rock in some strange part of Antarctica. You
yeah.
know, it's ingrained in culture, and yeah, I mean, I think you kind of nailed it. Where, and I mean, obviously, to say the best, there's always a level of subjectivity, right? Like it's
Oh,
impossible to get rid of it because it's like, okay, well, the best what?
yeah,
It's like we could look at it and say, okay, well, if it's from that sort of just musical gut place, I don't think I could argue against Led Zeppelin 2. And at the same time, you could have reversed the two records, and I don't know if I would have argued against that either because of the impact of one.
yeah,
But two is one of those records I think that like certainly if for non-Zeppelin fans, it's a little bit more palatable.
yep.
It goes down a little easier. And it's a front to back record, which, you know, for me is I just love a front to back record. I love a record you can put on and there's just not a bad song on it. And Zeppelin managed that for I think 4 or 5 records straight, you know, without really putting a bad track on a record. And yeah, two, it's sort of like four in that way where it's just like there's this inherent kind of greatness to it where you just it's so solid. It is
Oh,
so
yeah.
solid.
Solid.
And I thought a lot about two when I was doing this, and I was like, it's hard because I'm a pretty big Zeppelin fan. So it was hard for me to just like not pull out some Zeppelin in 1969. It was hard for me to not pull out the Beatles in 1969. I'm a huge Beatles fan.
Yeah.
Thankfully, Floyd didn't really do anything of any consequence that year. Uma Guma's okay or whatever, but
It's
I
a
don't,
little hard to digest.
yeah, I mean, I'm still not a huge fan of that record. I like some of it. It's got moments. Um, and you know, for certain, there's this sort of. I think what I ended up doing was sort of. I guess I kind of cheated a little bit, where I was thinking about, okay, I'm going to kind of dive into what did the musicians of the era think because they were there,
Smart.
right? And that's how I ended up landing on the band because I didn't want to. I knew I wanted to pick the band just from my own gut because they're like my favorite band. But then it was sort of like, okay, no, I can't do that. But then looking at influence, and again, kind of all going back to what we were talking about, it's another record where it's very raw. You've got 5 guys just playing in a room, and most of that record, the Brown record, is straight live, right? The vocals are done live, everything's done live, which is kind of a feat in its own. But yeah, this sort of, and the records that kept coming up when I was going through like the records that were being talked about by musicians was the Zeppelin records, the band record, the Crimson record, and then a lot of sort of pining about Abbey Road because everyone kind of knew the Beatles were going away. But yeah, for just pure records, I kept coming back to It's funny that you gave so much thought to that Neil Young record, because after listening to it, it was like, oh, man, this is such a solid record. Like
It's a
every
solid record.
tune is so good.
And actually, so Neil Young actually had 2 records out in this year as well.
Hmm.
But yeah, I mean, like everyone knows this is Nowhere. I mean, that's really his masterpiece.
Yeah, I mean that, and
Chris is good too. Well,
Harvest is
he's got a
amazing.
lot of great records, but yeah, I mean that's
Those, yeah, but those two are kind of the Neil Young records, right?
yeah.
And so yeah, I think for me, I probably came at it a little bit more like the greatest record of all time, maybe being the one that had the most overarching effect on the musicians.
Yes.
Because they were the ones that are going to make the music going forward. And that's sort of how I landed on the band, just because I couldn't find anyone who wasn't sort of in love with what they were doing at that time, right? But then I could make the exact same argument for Zeppelin, because all the guys that wanted to do heavy rock, for them, it was the Zeppelin stuff.
Yeah.
And
it's a real tough one. I think maybe we're gonna find, if we do a few more of these, we're gonna find that there probably will be a record that is just absolutely undeniable,
unanimous.
that has
Well,
everything. I
already thought of a few. Like, I mean, if we get to, I mean, there's some interesting years where it's like, okay, well, I mean, if we went 2 years forward, we went to 71. How do you not, how could it ever be in a million years that you don't pick like a Dark Side of the Moon or a Led Zeppelin 4 in their respective years? Do you know what I mean?
exactly.
It's so hard because they're so big. So like 71 and 73, it's almost like you can't do anything. You know what I mean? It is those records because, well, it's almost like a well duh.
Yes.
Right? Where 69, it felt like there was a little bit more wiggle room this year. There's a lot of records that could be and I bet you if you did a poll, it would be the same 3 or 4 records we're talking about, right? Like Abbey Road would be up there. Both Zepp records would certainly be up there, and the band would be there. If this was like if you were talking to music people, they would be there. If you were talking to like any music journalists, they love the band, so they'd be in there. And that's another reason I think maybe deep down I kind of wanted to pick this record, is because I know how important it is, and yet it's still relatively unknown. Like not everybody knows the band the way they know Zepp, Floyd, the Beatles. So as you know, I'm kind of an ambassador.
Oh yeah. No.
What I really like is that I'm seeing so much of them around now. The last like 5 years, there's so many bands that are coming out, and it's like, so what are your influences? And they lead with, well, we're really into the band. There's this weird credibility in liking the band now, because you go back to it and it's extremely undeniable, right? Like it's, you go back and listen to it and go, oh, okay. So these guys were arguably the best band on the planet. 5 brilliant musicians, 3 of them can sing. A couple of them are straight virtuosos, and it's like, for their genre of music, I don't think anyone was even coming close. And like there's a lot, you know, Crosby, Stills and Nash were essentially doing a similar thing, and made a lot of great music, and yet they all wanted to be in the band. Eric Clapton really wanted to be in the band, you know, and that sort of romantic element to them, where kind of like King Crimson, where they're when you're a fan of them, you feel like you own it a little bit.
Gotcha.
Right?
Yeah.
When you're a Zeppelin fan, you're aware that you're sharing it with everyone. I know that I'm not the only Zeppelin fan. Everybody loves Zeppelin.
Sure. Yeah. Like there's a little bit of a hipster element, I think, with the band, right?
There is, and it's funny because when I was falling in love with them, there was not, right? Like when I was a teenager, I'd tell people like, oh, I love the band, and they'd be like, who? The band? Which band? What are you talking about? And for a long time, my only way in with people was to reference The Last Waltz, because that's all anybody knew them for. Okay. Right? Like not even a record. It was the Martin Scorsese movie. Like, oh, right. The band, Last Waltz. Whereas now, yeah, it's definitely become sort of a, like we were talking before we started rolling, it's the curly mustache group of people are really starting to get into the band, which is great, because, you know, the more exposure, the better. And I can remember watching interviews with like Mumford and Sons and bands like that were referencing like, oh, we're big fans of the band, which makes sense, because I mean, they were a band that it's so hard to compare like the band to King Crimson or Led Zeppelin, because it's so much about classic songwriting, right? It's about sort of these songs that tell a story, and it's purely about melody and arrangement.
Yep.
And that's what it is. It's songwriting and arrangement. Whereas with Crimson, or certainly with Zeppelin, it's power and sound and sort of this, like we said, this confidence that comes out that like just makes you feel like I want to drive a fast car. You know, it's just got that visceral thing. So it's like, from the visceral point of view, it's like Zeppelin all day long. And then from the sort of maybe slightly more thoughtful point of view, you'd end up more in the Abbey Road band camp, right? So it's like they have too much. It's all sort of romanticized. Like every single record has that, you know. You can basically, after, I guess, once you hit about Rubber Soul, right? Rubber Soul, Revolver, the White Album, Pepper, Let It Be, like they're all these iconically huge records. So I feel like it doesn't get the right play. And then, you know, as I said, I would take in the argument with Pet Sounds versus Revolver, I would always argue for Rubber Soul just because I like it more. But it's this back and forth where they were driving each other, right? You had the Beatles making Rubber Soul, Revolver, and then Pet Sounds comes out, and then the Beatles go out and they make Sgt. Pepper's as a response to that, and then Brian tries to outdo them by making Smile and loses his mind in the process. And this sort of, and yet there was this respect too, right? Like Brian loved the Beatles loved the Beach Boys. And they just kind of kept pushing each other back and forth. And I think that's a big thing that is sort of sorely lacking in modern music, that we did have, you could argue, in maybe the early 90s, where bands were pushing each other that way. So yeah, I mean, it's all subjective, but at the same time, it's fun to try to be objective and say, like, okay, you know, Abbey Road is a great record objectively because, but like it's the Beatles, so it's hard to do that. It might be a little easier to be objective about a band that doesn't carry that kind of baggage, right?
So this is an interesting point then. So is there some way that we could come to a consensus what we think is the greatest album of 1969 based on our choices, and even just based on I don't know if our opinion has maybe changed in the last hour?
The thing is, like, I could make a solid argument for any of the records we've talked about.
For sure.
Do you know what I mean? So like, to consensus pick one, I mean, we probably could, because I think we'd be in agreement that any of these records is great. I think for cultural significance and all of that, I mean,
I'd probably go with the Band.
I think the Band, that record changed more than most of the other stuff. As far as like, but I mean, at the same time, like, okay, but then if we argued for Zeppelin 1 instead of Zeppelin 2, I could make the exact same argument there, right? Because Zeppelin 1 definitely changed things dramatically, even though like Zeppelin 2 might be the better record, you know?
It's kind of a tough one, because it's almost like Zeppelin 1, I think, exceeds unbelievably in certain areas, but then it does fall short. I would say, I mean, like, no one would ever pick Zeppelin 1 and say this has got the greatest lyrics and songwriting.
Exactly.
Again, it's very weak. It's, if anything, it's sort of stolen some quasi throw away blues lines.
Yeah, that then get like turned into this like hulkish version of themselves that just sounds so awesome.
But that's the thing. Like, the whole thing is just so great. I overlook that every time I listen to the album.
Oh, me too. It's the power, it's the feeling. But when if we were to break it down, And see, like, this is why right off the top I was talking about how it was hard for me actually between, I was legitimately torn as to which one of my two picks was my favorite and which one, because I thought that one of those two records was the best record of that year. I really thought, like, okay, objectively speaking, I think one of these two records might be the best record. Now, the point for me, the reason why I end up sort of saying, okay, I think King Crimson's my favorite, is because I just was obsessed with it and still am to some degree. And it's one of those records I put on my headphones and I'm gone. I'm not in this realm anymore, right? I'm off in La La Land listening to King Crimson. But there's a few points of contention on the record, right? You've got, I mean, is I Talk to the Wind one of the greatest songs I've ever heard? I don't think so.
For me, it's always kind of been Moonchild.
See, here's the thing about Moonchild for me, and I'm glad you brought that up. The first 2.5 minutes or whatever, the little singing part,
yep,
I like it enough. It's okay. It doesn't blow me away. And then you get about 6 minutes of stuff, right? Just kind of noise and some random psychedelic jamming, which is very sonically interesting.
It's cool.
It's cool. But then at the last 3 minutes of Moonchild, there's this like kind of cohesive jamming part that happens that I think personally might be the most beautiful part on the record, is the last like 3-4 minutes of Moonchild. The guitar playing, and it could be improvised. Like it kind of sounds like it is, but it's just so good. But then there is that 6 minutes of oddness before that, and then sort of this weird 2-minute song at the beginning of it. And it's kind of hard to say, like, because that comes right on the heels of I Talk to the Wind, right? I think maybe they're like songs 2 and 4 on the record. I'd have to look at that right quick. It's funny that I can't remember that.
I actually have the album here too. Let me just.
Yeah, so it's track 2 is I Talk to the Wind, and 4 is Moonchild. So you have Epitaph in between those. So yeah, I think it's 2 and 4, James. So you've got Epitaph stuck in between those, which I think might be my favorite song on the record, actually.
It's a beautiful song.
Such a beautiful song. And like for me, Epitaph and Court of the Crimson King, and you're a good person to talk to. I've always heard this weird, like I hear Metallica when I hear those songs. I hear this weird, like what became epic heavy metal later. I hear it in Epitaph. I hear it in the Court of the Crimson King. This sort of like, it's this minor, not bluesy at all, right? Like just take the pentatonic out. This is straight like Aeolian music, right? It's just
gotcha. Yeah.
The minor scale, which is what, Metallica was based on, was just sort of this minor heavy rock music. And I really hear a lot of that on, in Epitaph and the Court of the Crimson King. And then later I hear it all over the Red record. There's a lot of the guitar harmonies and stuff that happen on Red that make me instantly think of Metallica. So there's sort of a little bit of that precursor to heavy metal going on. But I do think that because of the oddness of the structure, like it's a 5-song record, 3 or 4 of the songs are pushing, 3 of them at least are pushing 10 minutes. Schizoid Man's probably 7. And then I Talk to the Wind is this sort of like little ditty. And so I don't feel like it has the cohesiveness that you'd expect out of a greatest record. If you're not like a real kind of nerdy music person, because you need patience for this record. It's got long songs. It's got these weird sections, and as good as it is, like when you go back and like I said, I was reading all these sort of things people were saying about it back in the day, with Pete Townsend calling it a masterpiece and stuff like that. But it was musicians who loved it.
Yes.
Right. I don't know that it had mass appeal. And I mean, ultimately, that's part of music, is to sort of like make music that can appeal to a lot of people. And clearly they weren't trying to appeal to everybody. That was clear from the record that they made. Whereas like if we were to look at Zeppelin or the band or the Beatles making much more palatable music, right? Much more digestible music for the average person. So that's sort of how I ended up with Crimson is the favorite because I wouldn't necessarily subject everyone to King Crimson, right? As a King Crimson fan, you know, some people do not like King Crimson. I show it to people sometimes and they get a little scared listening to it because it can be kind of overwhelming, so much going on. Whereas with the band record, it's songs, right? Every song is a good song.
You can't poke any holes in that band record.
No, it's so solid front to back. It has a lot of their best work is on this record. I mean, we've got Night They Drove Old Dixie Down, Up on Cripple Creek, Across the Great Divide, Whispering Pines, Rockin' Chair, Jawbone, King Harvest. There's not a bad song on this record.
Yeah, it's solid.
So yeah, for me, it was sort of like that mix of like, okay, this one's more about songs, and it's the one that sort of like immediately after that one came out, there was this sort of crazy shift in folk music and in sort of an American rock music. I feel like the band had a huge influence over here, and I mean they definitely had a huge influence over in England too. I mean Floyd and the Beatles and stuff, huge into these records, the first couple of band records, but I feel like their influence lied a little bit more in like the Laurel Canyon area. A lot of the sort of American rock music that came after had this little sort of country folky twang to it that wasn't there before, whereas like maybe Zeppelin were a little bit more influence overseas, over in Britain.
It was definitely British for sure.
Yeah, it had this, you know, and it makes sense. I mean, you have the band are a Canadian American band and Zeppelin are a British band, and there was definitely some crossover with, you know, lots of American bands being influenced by Zepp and a lot of British bands being influenced by the band. But it was almost like, it's funny too, because we're almost arguing these, it's almost highbrow and lowbrow, right? Like the band was sort of this really classy group of dudes, right? Like the way they dressed, the way they talked, they were just like, everyone wanted to kind of be friends with these dudes. Like these dudes are cool, but in this really sort of sophisticated blazer kind of way, blazers and cool caps. And then Zeppelin, it was like this whole other thing. You know, when those first two Led Zeppelin albums came out, it wasn't an intellectual conversation, right? It was like, wow, this music hits.
Yeah.
It hits you right in the head. It's not making you think about like, wow, this record really makes me think of the history of Britain. Whereas like the band sort of made records that made you like think about where you lived and like the history of the place that you come from, North American music.
Yeah.
Whereas Zeppelin, they weren't making any statement. They were just like, we're going to make music that's going to make you move around. So it's almost like they're making two different kinds of music, right? Yeah. Zeppelin's trying to get you out of your chair, get you moving, getting you banging your head and kind of getting you feeling confident about yourself, ready for the day. The band wants you to sit down at the end of said day, pour yourself a little glass of whiskey and contemplate, think about things a little bit, right? So it's two completely different speeds. Yeah. But why I would probably take any of those over the Beatles, and this is something I thought a lot about, is that the Beatles, certainly Paul, amazing songs, but they often didn't have the gravitas, the weight to them, the importance to them. You know, like even on Abbey Road, I mean, we've got songs on here that like they're Maxwell's Silver Hammer. Yeah.
Or
you know,
Garden. I mean,
Octopus's Garden. Like, we got to get one for Ringo. And at the same time, like, and then you get a song like "Oh Darling," which again, there's not a whole lot there, and yet it's an amazing song because of the, you know, one of Paul's greatest vocal performances. It's powerful. But then right after "Oh Darling," you get hit with the Octopus's Garden. But then after Octopus's Garden, it's "I Want You, She's So Heavy," one of the greatest rock and roll songs I've ever heard in my life. So, and then there's the medley, which is brilliant. I love the medley on the record. But I just find it's a little all over the place, you know, because you got Paul's kind of being goofy. You've got John very much in his sort of, I want to make important music that says something phase. and then you had George Harrison sort of overtaking them both as a songwriter. Like Here Comes the Sun and Something are arguably the two best songs on the record, and George wrote both of them. So for me, it's like, yes, it's an amazing record and it deserves all the praise it gets. But like when you're talking about best something, you really got to get down to like the minutia of it.
Yeah.
And there's little holes in Abbey Road. There's these little tiny holes in it that just kind of take away from it a little bit. Whereas I can't find a hole in the band record. It's genuine. It sounds like five guys all making music for one purpose. The same way those Zeppelin records to me sound like four guys making music for one purpose. And like the holes that you can poke in those Zeppelin records are more like, well, they hadn't really figured out who they were as songwriters yet. They're just coming out. Like Jimmy Page wasn't a songwriter. He was a session guy. And all of a sudden, like, he's got to come up with tunes. Yeah. Robert Plant wasn't a songwriter. John Paul Jones wasn't a songwriter. So they didn't even have a songwriter in the band. So the fact that their first record is essentially them just being like, let's play the blues really heavy, isn't surprising, right? And, the songwriting's a little better on the second record than it is on the first one. It's a little better on the third record than it was on the second one. And then Led Zeppelin 4 is the pinnacle of them as songwriters because they figured it out.
Which is what bands did, right? I mean, like even the Beatles and the Stones were a cover band originally.
Exactly. And like the band, and some people know this, but I mean, they were Levon. Well, first off, they were Ronnie Hawkins and the Hawks, rest in peace, Ronnie. And then they became Levon and the Hawks. They actually made a record as Levon and the Hawks in 1964, I believe, that almost no one's ever heard. And then they hooked up with Bob Dylan. So they got to go out on tour with, one of the pinnacle songwriters of the era, follow him around on tour for a couple of years, watch him compose music, watch what he does. So it's not surprising that like they kind of had a little bit of an advantage, right? They had been a band when they made their first record. They had been a band for 10 years when music from Big Pink came out. And they'd spent 3 years or so as Bob Dylan's backing band traveling around with him. So they kind of had a bit of an upper hand on that first record where they had been learning and writing songs for years and kind of throwing away the stuff that most bands would put on their first record. They were tossing that stuff and getting better as songwriters. So really, in a weird way, I feel like the band kind of their first record is what most bands' third or fourth record would be because they had already been a band for 10 years. Right.
And that's crazy to hear that they were. So Ronnie Hawkins' band started in the late 50s. That's wild.
Yeah, Ronnie and the Hawks with this lineup, with these guys, formed in 1958.
That's crazy.
So like before the Beatles existed and stuff, like the band are like, they're legitimately like, it bothers me because I'm such a huge fan. They belong in that conversation with the Beatles, with the Stones, sure. As like a band.
They're the older guys.
They're the older guys. These are, and like they were playing rock and roll music in the late 50s. They were covering, Elvis Presley and Ray Charles and doing what was like just being called rock and roll, right? Like it just got the name. And actually, if you can find, it might be on Spotify and stuff now, I don't know. But that record that they made as Levon and the Hawks is... It sounds like 50s rock and roll, right? It doesn't even sound like the Beatles or anything. It sounds like 50s rock and roll, which was really cool. And it was the same five guys. It was the band that made that record.
And that includes like Who Do You Love?
Who Do You Love?
That's gotta be like one of the greatest rock and roll songs of all time.
100%. And when you hear that, the Ronnie Hawkins version, which is out all the time, you hear it on the radio all the time. That's the band is playing that. He's singing it and the band's in the background going, "Who do you love?" That's Ricky Danko and Richard Manuel doing those backups and stuff, right? So they're this sort of secret thing that like, and that's why like when you look at how they showed up in 68 and everyone just lost their mind, right? Like, but everyone already knew who they were. Neil Young and Joni Mitchell and Crosby, Stills and Nash guys and the Beatles, everyone knew who they were already. And the reason, I mean, they're even called the band is because that was just the affectionate name for them because they didn't have their own name. They were just Bob Dylan's band. So people would just be like, oh, the band is up at Dylan's place. and then they became the band. But that's, they were already very ingrained in all of that. And so on paper, it looks like the band just popped out of nowhere in 1968, made this record that like changed music forever. And oh yeah, and these guys used to be Dylan's backing band. Like before they were Dylan's backing band, they had been Ronnie Hawkins' backing band for like 3 years. They had been out on their own as Levon and the Hawks for another 3 or 4 years before doing 3 or 4 years as Bob Dylan's band. So I mean, there's a lot more to them than people realize. And I think that's sort of why, they were able to do that. I mean, their first 2 records are just, I mean, I've never looked at a top 100 list anywhere for greatest records of all time that didn't include both of those 2 records. Music from Big Pink and the Brown record are always on them. And it really shows something with those guys, because I mean, they really, from a record sales point of view, from a hit singles point of view, they don't have any of that. The record sales numbers, they're relatively low. They haven't had any number 1 songs, although I would personally make the argument that certainly The Weight is one of the most played songs of all time. Yeah. I remember growing up when I started first, playing gigs at the bars and stuff and going out to the bars, there was no song covered more than The Weight. Every band I saw as a teenager and as a person in my early 20s played The Weight. It was on the radio all the time. So like they do have those sort of iconic songs. The Night They Drove Old Dixie Down, obviously pretty iconic, but they don't have the numbers. They don't have all the hit singles. They don't have all the million sales records. And yet still, all these years later, they've managed to stay in that conversation just because of how good those records were and how sort of people, journalists, other musicians will not let it go away because it's like, no, this is important. And I've always really liked that about the band, is that like you can dismiss a lot of stuff of that time and say like, well, in the grand scheme of things, it's really not that important. Sure, it was good. With the band, it didn't do much at the time. And yet all these years later, we're still talking about how great it was. And I think a big part of that, and a big part of why they're, my band and why I love them so much, is sort of the genuineness of it being 5 dudes. They're all so talented at what they do, especially for their era. They were just really, really solid musicians. They've got 3 lead singers, which, a lot of my favorite bands do. The Floyd and the Beatles, that sort of 3 singer thing. Yep. So there's a legitimacy, I think, to the band. And I think that's like going back to what you said before, why they've kind of become a hipster band, is because if you take them on as something you like, there's this legitimacy to it, where it's like, oh, you must know something if you like the band. You must know. You must be in on the secret because you found them and you know how good they are. Yeah. But for me, it's the 5 guys in a room thing. It's just they play so well together. And when you hear them play like live, like for me, the greatest live record ever made is Rock of Ages, which is the band's live record. Because it's this wicked example of like the songs are better. They're better than they are on the record, which a lot of the times with live records is not the case. It's just a band trying to get like as close to the record as they can when they play it live. The band does not do that. They take the song and it becomes a whole nother thing when they play it live, because that's what they are. They're a band. Being in the studio is not where they're supposed to be. They're supposed to be in front of, people playing their music.
Well, one other great concert that you can see the band really be in their prime in is the Festival Express.
Yeah, actually, Festival Express is sort of what solidified my love of the band. When that came out, and geez, that would be, I want to say I was maybe in my early 20s when Festival Express came out.
Now was the Brown album out when that concert happened?
When they did that? Yes. So the Brown album would have already been out. I think Festival Express would have occurred in like, well, what year did Joplin die?
71, I think.
Okay, so I think Festival Express would probably be like them touring in 1970.
Okay.
Because I know that tour, Joplin was on that tour. The Dead were on that tour. And I think the Dead were sort of, it's funny because right after that tour, I believe, is when the Dead went and made American Beauty and Working Man Dead. After going on this long ass tour with the band, they come back and they're like, 3-part vocal harmony. That seems like the way to go. you know, so I don't think that was a coincidence.
So the
Um,
so the band inspired the Grateful Dead.
I 100%. I mean, if you listen to those two records in particular, which for me are honestly two of the best records anyone's ever made, which is so surprising out of this weird acid rock live band. Um, but they went home, I think, after basically hearing Big Pink, hearing the Brown album, doing a little touring with the band, and like if you watch Festival Express, it's clear who everyone's sort of looking up to when you watch it, right? Like there's everyone wants to be around the band. They just want to be around these guys. Because I mean, if you read about them, Eric Clapton and George Harrison and all these guys have all kind of said there was something about those guys, the way they carried themselves, the way they didn't seem to care what anyone else was doing musically. Like they just didn't care. And that made them desirable because it was like, why don't you care? You know, why aren't you trying to please everyone? And it's like, well, no, because these guys have been doing this since the late 50s and they like what they do. They're not trying to have big hit singles. They're trying to make music that they really, really like. And, you know, you had these sort of crazy influences, right? From Robbie being sort of an old blues guy. And then Levon being like a old school, like down home country guy. And then Richard was a big Ray Charles soul music fan. So, you know, they just sort of made music that fit those aesthetics and they just sort of slammed it all together. But I mean, there's a great scene in Festival Express where they're all sitting around and they're singing "Ain't No More Cain," which is an old traditional song that is actually shows up on some early band stuff. And Ricky Danko is sitting in the middle of the train and he's basically directing the Flying Burrito Brothers, Janis Joplin, Buddy Guy is there because he was on that tour as well. And he's basically directing them all in the backing vocals and then singing. And apparently they were drinking whiskey laced with acid and stuff. But I mean, it's just this epic scene where you know, they're on a train and the camera's going around and all these people you're seeing are like, is that Buddy Guy? Is that Janis Joplin? Is that Jerry Garcia? And you can just see they're all so taken with the sincerity of it. Because that's the one thing that like really, really, really draws me to the band, aside from their talent and the great songs and everything, is that it always seems so sincere. They weren't writing songs to make them look cool. You know, like some of these songs are really like, they almost sound like they were written for old people. You know what I mean? It's not music to try to be cool, you know? It's music to like settle you in at the end of the day and to like warm your soul kind of thing. And I think that like legitimate sincerity just really attracted people. And like, you know,
It's sincere, but it's wise.
that's the thing. It's sincere, but it's also coming from that place of wisdom of like, we've been there, we've actually seen it. And when you look back on it, it's legit, because even though like, okay, this is our first record, it's like, no, we've been a band for longer than all of you guys, you know, and we're kind of grown men now. And look at us, we dress in our nice suits with our little bowler caps and stuff and their nice boots. They had this totally different aesthetic. And within a couple of years, you know, that was the aesthetic, right? That's how the Crosby, Stills and Nash, that's how Neil Young, that's how Joni Mitchell, they all kind of went from the hippie look to the oh no, we need bowler hats and sport coats because you got to look dignified, you know?
So Matt, so okay, I'm gonna sum this all up. I think you made a great argument for the band.
Mm-hmm.
I agree with everything that you said about the band. So I would say that album probably, I would say, is probably the best of the year, or at least it is the best, argued to be the best one,
Mm-hmm.
pound for pound. I will say though that I do feel that the King Crimson album does have its shortcomings.
Yeah.
One thing that always bugged me about that record was when it starts off with 21st Century Schizoid Man. It's so heavy.
That noise.
Oh yeah, it's just so intense. Probably the heaviest thing that anyone's ever heard.
Yeah.
But then the album just goes quiet for the rest of the record.
You never get that intensity again.
That intensity back, and that's always bugged me as a record.
Yeah.
It's almost like that's kind of why I think if they just stuck cat food somewhere on that record, or maybe even pictures of
the city or something, yeah.
Just stick it maybe as song 3, maybe song 5, maybe just kind of have bookends.
Yeah.
Heaviness. for me, that's always been an issue with that record.
Well, yeah, it's got this
So
one blazing rock song on it, but just one.
just one, yeah, yeah. So for me, that's always bugged me.
Yeah.
But as far as the band, I can't pick any weak parts of that record.
Yeah.
And even with Zeppelin, it's just so over the top, crazy for what it is.
Yeah.
I can't really pick any holes in Zeppelin either, but I can pick
No.
holes in that Crimson album.
Yeah. Yeah.
But song for song, like Epitaph or In the Court of the Crimson King or
Yeah.
yeah, or 21st Century Schizoid Man, that is some of the best music that's ever been written.
Yeah, I think it's got 3 of the best songs ever written on it. That's sort of like why it even though it's got these sort of weird gaps, those 3 songs, and we should mention it's 3 of the 5, right? There's only 5 on the whole record, and 3 of them are so good and were legitimately out of left field. Nothing had ever sounded like that before. Schizoid Man was definitely its own thing and really invented what we know as progressive music. I mean, you could argue that that was sort of the starting point for modern prog, the what's the word I'm looking for? The prototype, if you will, to get it all started. It's got the sort of tempo changes and the unison playing at high speeds, and then the strange, okay, now we're going to do a halftime for the verse. It's got all of that weird proggy stuff that nothing had ever had before. And instantly it's like,
and that's the metal connection though, right? Because that's what influenced those thrash guys. Metallica.
Exactly. Was that unison playing and the quickness of it and the snare following the guitar and all of that. So yeah, I think that record kind of goes unsung as a precursor to heavy metal sometimes, because Schizoid Man certainly has it. And like I said, I've always personally heard it in Epitaph and Court of the Crimson King, just because rock music wasn't minor music back then. People weren't writing in the minor key, not entire songs with like the vocal melody and everything being like, everything's got to be minor. I mean, you heard it in pop music a little bit for the sad songs, but you'd never heard it done in this way that like really can only be described as like epic music. You hear it and you're just kind of like, where's my sword? It's this like slow, like thoughtful battle music. And but yeah, like as a and again, that's why I kind of picked it as my favorite, because it's like,
fair enough.
It's personal. I love it. But I could totally get someone hearing it and going like, I talked to the wind. What's that? And it's like, well, no, you just got to get through that one. Okay. That's part of it. It's a little bit of a palate cleanser before you get to the next song. And then after you get Epitaph, you're like, whoa, man, that was really intense. And then you get another little palate cleanser, they give you Moonchild and you're like, I'm just going to be dreamy for a minute. And then things get really intense again. Court of the Crimson King, with its 4 fake endings. Which, I always kind of wish that at the end of, going back to what you said, at the end of in the Court of the Crimson King, the song, they just like got heavy with it for a minute, like finish the album kind of the way you started the album. Give me some more electric guitar, because there's like no more on the record after Schizoid Man.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think we've kind of nailed it down to where like maybe King Crimson was like the most surprising record of that year. Like, Rookie of the Year. King Crimson won Rookie of the Year. Because, arguably what they did was probably a little bit more unique than what Zeppelin did. The songwriting was better, I think, than what Zeppelin did. But
I agree.
Zeppelin they just had this package that worked so well together, and it's almost indefinable, right? Zeppelin really are one of those bands. It's hard to put your finger on it. So it's like, well, are the lyrics good? Not particularly. They're servable. They get the job done. The playing on it is like, it's certainly not like, okay, we need perfect takes, guys. There's no perfect takes on those first 2 Zeppelin records. There's all kinds of little mistakes and stuff, and yet it adds so much to it. Yeah. And were they the best players? Like, well, John was, for sure. Bonham was, but the other guys weren't the best. I mean, again, maybe John Paul Jones, you could probably make the argument that he was the best rock bass player at the time, but Jimmy Page, I don't think belongs in that conversation at all as best guitar player. And yet he's still one of my favorite rock and roll guitar players because of the way he did it.
Maybe you could say this. I could argue that Jimmy Page was one of the greatest producers of that.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, no doubt about that. I mean, he legitimately changed the way records were made.
Yeah.
And he had a real natural sense of how to get the point across.
Yeah.
You know, like those drum sounds that, you know, everybody, I mean, there's no more fetishized drum sound than the Bonham drum sound. And there is no Bonham drum sound. There's no one drum sound. His drums sound different on every record, but Jimmy always found a way to represent Bonham in a very good light, you know, and sometimes it was 2 mics overhead for your When the Levee Breaks, and you get maybe the most iconic drum sound of all time. And Jimmy knew to do that.
Jimmy Wolf Guitar